time. Okay, thank you very much. So I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Robert West, who's a Professor of Health Psychology at University College London. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Anne. Well, it hardly seems like a year ago since we were last here. Quite a lot has happened. I guess my role in the proceedings is to set the scene with primarily with data that we've been collecting in England, to update you on where things are with that. I want to finish by showing you my first attempts at modelling what I think has been the impact of the advent of e-cigarettes and the growth in e-cigarette use on smoking prevalence in this country. A lot of the background you don't really need to know, but obviously it has become prevalent in many countries, and England is a very interesting case in point because we have adopted, relative to most other countries, quite a liberal view on e-cigarettes in terms of, at least up till now, treating them primarily as a consumer product unless they make a medicinal claim. And so in the context of a sort of scenario that many countries that have much stricter regimes on e-cigarettes worry about, because they think, well, if we were more liberal, what on earth might happen? I think it's useful for them and for us going forward to track how things have gone in that situation. So I'm going to present, many of you will have seen these slides because these are slides from the Smoking Toolkit study that we publish on this particular slide set. We publish, with the exception of the last couple of slides, we publish on a quarterly basis, updating anyone who's interested on the state of play with regards to e-cigarettes and related factors in England. But this gives me an opportunity to present it to those of you who've not seen it, and I do recommend that you keep track of it over the course of the year as we go along. So the job of the Smoking Toolkit study is to track key performance indicators relating to smoking and tobacco control in England, and we do it by monthly prevalence surveys, and actually for a long time we've also been doing follow-ups 6 months later, and we hope to introduce those again if funding allows. But essentially we're getting a sort of snapshot every month of a new population, and we're looking at things like smoking prevalence, cessation rates, how many people are trying to stop smoking, what they're using to try to stop smoking, and how successful they're being, at least up until the time that we survey them. And because smoking is one of those areas where we've got really good data on relapse curves, we can be pretty confident that if we know how long someone has been abstinent for, even over a relatively short period of time, we can predict how long that they're going to be, or how many of those are going to be abstinent indefinitely. The relapse curves in the field of smoking are quite well documented. So as I mentioned, these are monthly surveys. Each monthly survey surveys a new sample of around 1,800 people, of whom these days around 450 will be smokers. And we've been collecting data on electronic cigarettes. We've actually been collecting data on electronic cigarettes since before 2011, but in 2011 we added questions on electronic cigarettes not only to people trying to stop smoking, but also to people who are still smoking, and more recently to people who'd never smoked as well. And the data in smokinginengland.info. So this is I suppose, one of the top line figures, which you can see here going back to the second quarter of 2011, where there was negligible electronic cigarette use among smokers and recent ex-smokers, that there then was a pretty steady rise, perhaps a slight accelerating rise, until about a year ago. And in about a year ago, things kind of stopped. They kind of have almost, well, I would say they've almost come to a halt. We don't know whether that will continue, and we don't know what the reason for it is. We can maybe have a discussion about that. But the other thing to note from this slide is that, that about 2/3 of people who use electronic cigarettes use them daily. So it's not the case, as it is with smoking, that the vast majority of smokers in this country are daily cigarette smokers, and the average is about 13 a day. With e-cigarette smokers, you'll see in a minute, even those who are not also smoking cigarettes, there's quite a lot who don't use it daily. People are very interested in the prevalence of e-cigarette use in people who've never smoked and in long-term ex-smokers. Never smoked because people are worried about whether it might act as a gateway into smoking primarily, or might addict a whole new generation of people who otherwise would never have become nicotine users, and long-term ex-smokers because of concern among some people that it might be something that attracts people who gave up smoking a long time ago back into nicotine, which wouldn't have happened otherwise. And these data are actually very interesting. They are to me anyway, because the rate of use you can see here among never smokers, this is age 16 plus, is really negligible. That's, there's a lot of data showing that. But it's the same as licensed nicotine products. It's no different. And in fact, if you look at the long-term ex-smokers, it's actually slightly less than licensed nicotine products. Now, I think that may change over time because, of course, they've been on the market for a less period of time. But the idea that e-cigarettes are in some way creating a new market for nicotine is not, at any rate at the moment, being borne out by the evidence. And then if we break that down into the use of nicotine products, including e-cigarettes, while still smoking, this dual use pattern, what you can see is that if you go back to the second quarter of 2011, just under 20% of smokers were using a licensed nicotine product and smoking at the same time. Okay, and almost none were using an electronic cigarette. And these lines have crossed. The prevalence at which people are using a licensed nicotine product has declined, but notice that it's declined steadily. That decline has not mirrored the pattern of growth in e-cigarette use. Now, to me, that rather casts some doubt on how far the decline in the use of licensed nicotine products has been due to the growth in e-cigarette use. I'm not sure that it has. In fact, if you track further back, that decline in the use of licensed nicotine products while smoking actually started before 2011. So actually what's happened is that e-cigarettes have somewhat grown the market for use of nicotine products, but even now, the percentage of people who are using an electronic cigarette and smoking at the same time is not that different from the proportion who are using a licensed nicotine product and smoking at the same time back in 2011. So again, it would be difficult to sustain the argument that electronic cigarettes have somehow either usurped or massively added to there's something really special going on there. We can have a discussion about that later. If you look at the prevalence of use of nicotine products of various sorts while in recent ex-smokers, that's people who've stopped within the last year, and it could be a month ago, it could be 11 months ago. These data show more scatter because it's a much smaller sample. We're down to about 1,000 people. So, but still a similar sort of pattern is what you see, which is there's been a fairly steady decline in the use of licensed nicotine products over this period. And then there was this growth in the use of e-cigarettes, which has now pretty much plateaued. So because there are so many more smokers out there than there are people who've only just stopped smoking, and because so few e-cigarette users are never smokers or long-term ex-smokers, the arithmetic becomes very simple that it's bound to be the case that the vast proportion or majority of people who are using e-cigarettes are going to be smokers as well. And we know from other research that most of those people are using e-cigarettes either as part of a quit attempt which they're currently making, or a part of a quit attempt which they have made, or because they want to cut down. Not such a high proportion are using it purely to circumvent the smoke-free legislation. But you can see that the vast majority of e-cigarette users also smoke. If you look at the age range of e-cigarette users, again, there's concern that it might be attracting a young, whole new cohort of people into nicotine use. But it follows from what I've said, just in terms of the arithmetic, that is likely that the pattern of the age range, or the age profile of people who are using e-cigarettes is going to be very much like the profile of smokers. And of course it is, as you can see from this graph. It's almost identical to that of smokers. So we're not seeing a huge sort of bulge in young people using e-cigarettes, or old people, or middle-aged people. It's just the same as smokers. If you look at the amount of e-cigarette use going on, this is a huge challenge for those of us who do research in this area. It's actually quite a challenge for looking at cigarette smoking, but it's one that we've chosen to ignore because it's too hard. But essentially, it's even more an obvious challenge with e-cigarettes, because how do you define the number of e-cigarettes that they use, or the number of sessions? With electronic cigarette use, as you know, a lot of it is fairly sort of intermittent or sporadic, or sometimes people will graze over a period of time. It's a bit more like snus or some other product like that. So once you get to looking at anything above daily use, it's very hard to quantify. But anyway, as you can see, we've done it on this slide. So whatever that means, I'm not sure. I guess it shows some kind of pattern in that the ex-smokers are probably using, as you would expect, more than the current smokers, and certainly more of the ex-smokers are daily users than current smokers. I'm particularly interested in smoking cessation, as many of you know, and we've been looking actually back since 2009 at the use of e-cigarettes as part of a quit attempt. And you can see that until around 2011, the bottom line there, the green line, it was bumbling along at almost zero, and then there was this huge growth in the rate at which people were using an e-cigarette as in their most recent quit attempt. And you can also see that over the same period, and actually starting before then, there was a decline in the use of nicotine replacement therapy bought over the counter and in some other methods of stopping smoking. And then you saw this huge rise, so that since a year ago, e-cigarettes are the favoured method by smokers of trying to stop smoking. Some of those will also use something else as well. They use a licensed nicotine product, or they'll use behavioural support from the Stop Smoking Services or Champix, but actually very few. Most people who use an e-cigarette to stop smoking, that's what they use. But you can see it's now the most common method at around 30%. But again, you can see that a year ago, something happened, and it seems like the lid was just put on it. And I think this is an important discussion point for later. There have been declines in the use of the Stop Smoking Services, and there have been declines in the use of licensed nicotine products and Champix over this period. Whether it's due to this, I don't know, because of course, over the last year, certainly, a year or two, there have been some substantial changes in the way that smoking cessation support has been funded in this country. So looking at the sort of bigger picture and trying to contextualize those data, one of the concerns that many public health colleagues have is that e-cigarettes and the advent of e-cigarettes and the popularity will undermine quitting. Because if you can use an e-cigarette and smoke at the same time, why would you go the whole hog and stop smoking? Now, if that were the case, you would expect to see a decline in the rate at which people are trying to stop smoking. And if e-cigarettes were somehow undermining people's ability to stop, you would also see a decline in the rate at which people are succeeding in stopping smoking. As you can see from the left-hand graph, over the period where we've seen this growth in e-cigarette use, we've actually seen a statistically significant increase in the rate at which people are trying to stop smoking. I, again, wouldn't want to claim, and I don't think anyone who's a proper researcher, as we say, in this field, would want to claim causality, but I think what we can say is that, at the very least, it would be very hard to sustain the argument that it's undermined quitting, and it may have contributed to it. If you look at the rate at which people are actually succeeding, you can see perhaps an even steeper increase in the rate. And in fact, over the time that we've been doing the Smoking Toolkit study, since 2007, the quit rates are actually higher than they are at any time since we've been looking at in terms of quit success. The overall quit rates, the last time they were as high as this, in fact they were a little bit higher, was 2007, which was just after the smoke-free legislation was brought in, which I think had a pretty big impact. If you look then at smoking prevalence, and obviously over this short period of time, it's hard to visualize the kind of trends that are occurring. But what you see is quarter by quarter that there has been a decline in cigarette smoking. The rate of decline this year so far has been 0.9 percentage points. Now that may not seem very much, but it's as high as we've seen historically since the 1970s, apart from the smoke-free. So the rate at which smoking prevalence is coming down is as good or better than it has been certainly for some years. What's interesting here, though, is that I think we are seeing a little bit of clear water between the prevalence of nicotine use, including licensed nicotine products and e-cigarettes, among people who are mostly recent ex-smokers, and the use of cigarettes. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops over time. But in both cases, there's been a decline. So even the total use of nicotine has declined. So just coming to the final couple of slides, this is my attempt, and it's a preliminary attempt to try to model what I think might be the effect of the introduction of e-cigarettes into our society over the last few years on smoking prevalence. And for that, like with any modelling, you have to make a number of assumptions. And I've tried to make the assumptions as conservative as possible in terms of only trying to assume things that I think we can be pretty confident are true. So for this assumption, I've assumed that none of the increase in the rate at which people are trying to stop smoking is due to e-cigarettes. I'm assuming that that's all due to the magnificent efforts of Public Health England and people like me. So what am I using to model the projected contribution of e-cigarettes? Purely that when as some of you will remember, earlier this year, Jamie Brown and I, my colleagues, published a paper in which we found that looking at the English population, that people, once you'd adjusted for all the other factors that might make a difference that we could measure, that people who were using an e-cigarette as part of a quit attempt were about 50% more likely to succeed than people who were using nothing at all or using a licensed nicotine product. And you also may remember that we were concerned, expressed concern, and have done and continue to do, that the licensed nicotine products, when used without any professional support just bought from a shop, don't seem to be having the kind of benefits that we would expect them to have. So what we're assuming here is that e-cigarettes are getting about the same level of success as a licensed nicotine product which is obtained from a health professional, not as effective as the stop smoking services, where all our evidence is that they increase your success rates by about 300%. So the increase, what e-cigarettes have done is to increase that middle ground of quite effective methods of stopping smoking. And again, we can have a discussion about this. But if you just put those figures into the model, you come up with an estimate with a stable quit rate of around 37%, assuming no increase, of a change in prevalence attributable to the e-cigarettes of around 0.05 of a percentage point of that 0.9 that we're observing. Now, that may not seem very much. I think, oh, well, is that really worth it? But that's about 20,000 additional ex-smokers, or about 10,000 lives saved, 10,000 people who are going to live who would otherwise have died, if that's right, even at 0.05 percentage points. So my point here, and this is an argument that I've had with some of my public health colleagues, is the thing about smoking is you don't have to have a huge impact on population rates of smoking to have a huge impact on the number of people who die, because smoking is so dangerous. So the key points then are the prevalence of e-cigarette use has increased up to about a year ago, and it seems to have flatlined since then. It is still the most popular method of stopping, with about 30% of quit attempts being attributable to, or using an e-cigarette, I think from this modelling that there may be a contribution that they're making to public health. I think it's very unlikely that they're making things worse. And the good news for all of us is that the prevalence of smoking and nicotine use has declined over this time period.